Report.
Okay, so I think we can start with the event. The recording has started as well, so that's all good. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for joining to this event. We have today with us Professor Olivier Marie from Erasmus University and Yiftach, who came all the way from Aruba. So we are very thankful for them to join us today. The event is hosted by AEclipse Study Association and in collaboration with HIAS Aruba. The idea is that we will present to you the international research project of last year. So what we did is that with a team of 15 students, we conducted a labor market assessment for the NGO HIAS to try to help them cope with the situation of Venezuelan migrants on the island. The event will have 3 different sessions. First, Yiftach will run through HIAS as an organization and what they do and what the office in Aruba does to help the Venezuelans. After that, Fema and myself will run through our research and explain how we collected data and the outcomes. And then finally, we'll have a presentation from Professor Olivier Marie about the economics of migration. I think also before we start, we can say that, we're a small group, we have a few people online, but feel free to cut us through the presentation to ask questions. We can keep it rather informal and just all have fun and try to get the most out of this event. So, Yiftach, I think you can come ahead.
Thanks, Idan. And I would like to thank AEclipse and the University of Erasmus for having us here. I think it was rather a really lucky encounter between AEclipse, who I think approached HIAS on a regional level. I think you managed to approach our economic inclusion director in Latin America, who then, asked who's interested in perhaps making connection with AEclipse in Rotterdam. And for us, it was really great timing. The fact that we are talking about it from the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which Aruba is part of, was very important. Also the knowledge of Dutch and the background of the students. So I will just start with just providing a little bit of background regarding HIAS, the organization, the Venezuelans in Aruba and the response to the situation of Venezuelan refugees and migrants, and then talk about the humanitarian response of HIAS itself in Aruba and lately in the Caribbean in general. Moving? No. All right. Okay, so HIAS is one of the oldest refugee agencies. It's actually a Jewish organization that was established in the 19th century in New York by Jewish refugees to try to assist refugees fleeing persecution, mostly in Russia, Eastern Europe, and later throughout the world. Basically, what we try to do is identify and assist people whose life are at risk and are survivors of persecution for who they are. But as you will see, we are using on a daily basis a much broader definition of who is a refugee, and you would see that in the case of protection of Venezuelans, which do not perhaps fit your typical or idea of a refugee when you think of people coming, let's say, from Syria or other countries. HIAS throughout World War II, before and after, really worked all over the world trying to assist Jewish refugees fleeing Europe, including the Netherlands. HIAS was present in the Netherlands, trying to assist Jewish refugees and Dutch Jews to sail away from the Netherlands just before the war, and did a lot of work after the war in 1946, 47, gathering Jewish refugees from the various displacement camps in Germany and Western Europe and find them a home, be it in the US mainly, but also Canada, South America, Australia, etc. While other organizations were focusing on Israel as a Jewish home for these refugees, HIAS was mainly assisting Jewish refugees in settling in other parts of the world. Another small history that HIAS has in the Kingdom of the Netherlands is actually in the 1960s. In 1961, HIAS assisted Jewish Cuban refugees fleeing Cuba after the revolution, and HIAS would fly the kids to Curacao, where in Curacao the Jewish community would host them for a few weeks until they were resettled in Miami, Florida, and today Miami is quite has a big Jewish Cuban community. However, in the last 30 years, luckily, we don't really have Jewish refugees anymore. So HIAS has opened up to refugees, migrants from all creeds, all nationalities, and basically is working to support, welcome, and safeguard the freedom of refugees, mainly through its resettlement work. HIAS really began because of its experience with bringing Jewish refugees to the US. HIAS became one of the 9 resettlement agencies working with the US authorities to resettle refugees from different refugee camps or other countries, and then through a network of volunteers assist in their integration in various communities in the US. And this is really interesting. I went once to a meeting of all these volunteers, and most of these volunteers were old Russian ladies in their 70s or 80s who came to the US in the 60s and 70s, now assisting, LGBT refugees from Uganda or young refugees from all over the world. And it was really nice to see this model of refugees assisting refugees. And that was a great experience. Our mission is really to protect the most vulnerable refugees, and we do that through our signatory approaches. These are the main areas of intervention. What we do is we provide legal assistance and then access to resettlement. We provide mental health and psychosocial assistance. We provide program for economic integration. We work with survivors of gender-based violence. And these are our core niche work that HIAS is really specialized in, but in small countries like Aruba or other operations where we are one of the main actors, then we provide assistance and engage in all other themes as well to advocate and ensure that refugees have access to basic needs and access to their rights, which is not always possible. And in Aruba, unfortunately, this is the case as well. So at the moment, we are working in 16 countries. As you can see, we have a focus on Latin America. Our base is in Silver Springs, Maryland. We moved from New York to Silver Springs a few years ago. And as I said, our main focus is in Latin America. It started in response to the situation in Colombia and the refugees fleeing Colombia. And Ecuador is one of our largest program, and I think we're the main international NGO that is working in Ecuador. And then we started working in Venezuela itself, again assisting Colombians. However, in the last 4 or 5 years, there is a quite large displacement of Venezuelan population. We are talking about 6 million Venezuelans who left Venezuela since 2014. And they have moved all over Latin America and Central America. They do that by flights, but also by walking on foot, and at times by boat if it's to Guyana, Aruba, or Curacao. Colombia is hosting around 1.5 million Venezuelans. And last year it has offered protection for 10 years for all Venezuelans fleeing to Colombia, which is quite a commitment to the support of Venezuelans. Then we have big populations also in Peru, and refugees are also moving to Chile, Argentina, and the cone of South America. Panama and Costa Rica are used as a transit point for refugees from all over the world, transiting from Colombia through the Darien Passage and going all the way to the Mexico-US border in order to cross into the US. We also have a situation in Nicaragua where there's quite a few refugees fleeing into Costa Rica. And recently we have the Northern Triangle situation, which is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where we have families, individuals fleeing criminal gang activities and in the situation of collapsed state, and they're crossing into Mexico and from there into the US. So we have a large presence on the US-Mexico border, both on the Mexican side and on the American side. During the Trump administration, he had a policy of keeping all asylum seekers in Mexico. So you had to apply for asylum in Mexico. HIAS was assisting them with legal assistance, and then you would cross the bridge to attend your court review in the US, and if admitted, you would then be admitted to the US. But apparently, almost no one was admitted. They also used regulation regarding to COVID to restrict these entries. And today, even under Biden, we have a situation of very limited access to the US and deportation of migrants to southern Mexico, to Guatemala, and to Haiti. There's quite a lot of Haitians who are crossing as well. So the situation in Latin America, people are on the move, where I think here there's a lot of focus on the movement across the Mediterranean and from Turkey to Greece into Europe. But as you can see, there's a lot of movements in Latin America as well. In Africa, we worked in Kenya and Chad, and I was the country director of HIAS Chad and established their operations there, where we assist refugees from Darfur. Unfortunately, I don't know if you were following the news, but in the last few weeks, there was a coup in Sudan, while Sudan was moving towards civil government in a coalition with the military. Now the military took over, which means that I don't think there will be any kind of a resolution to the Darfur situation anytime soon. Kenya is hosting refugees from all over East Africa, particularly Somalia, and we have now the situation of Ethiopia. Let's see what will happen there. In Israel, it's one of our also oldest programs, where we have refugees mainly from Sudan and Eritrea. Greece, we work in Lesbos and provide legal assistance. Austria is probably our oldest international program, where we assist Iranian from religious minorities and also LGBTI to reunite with their family members in the US. And Belgium is just a representation for the EU. So this is the areas we are working. And as I said, in response to the Venezuela situation, we expanded significantly. And in the last 2 years, we've opened HIAS Peru, HIAS Colombia, HIAS Aruba, HIAS Guyana, and HIAS Mexico. With the situation now in Afghanistan and Ethiopia, I'm sure there are going to be quite a lot of changes in terms of focus, in terms of funding, and in terms of available support for the Venezuelan population. If you have any questions, please ask. Zoom. Aruba is a constituent country within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It has 110,000 inhabitants, plus around 2 million tourists that arrive on a yearly basis. It has the highest ratio in the world of displaced population in comparison to the host community, which is not really spoken about or known. So it's number one after, I think, Lebanon or Jordan. Aruba is a signatory of the 1951 Refugee Convention, unlike Curacao, which is not. It is only 30 kilometers north of Venezuela, so it's easily accessible and has a history of contact, relationship, family relationship, commerce, and also smuggling of contraband and probably people between Aruba and the state of Falcon, which is just across us. And when the days are clear, you can actually see, Venezuela. You can see one mountain from the shore in Aruba. Aruba also hosts quite a lot of other migrants from Colombia, Dominican Republic, Haiti. We have people from Curacao, we have Surinamese, we have Chinese, Indians, quite a large mix, but the Venezuelan community is probably the most significant. Any questions regarding that? Has anyone been to Aruba except for the IRP team? You should come. So what are the challenges for the Venezuelan population and for Aruba in general? So Venezuelans, when they come to Aruba, unlike the rest of Latin America, they're not really, while they can apply to asylum and go through an RSD, the process of determining if they are refugees or not, at the end of the day, no Venezuelan was recognized as a refugee. Holland is using, the more conservative definition of who is a refugee based on the convention, while Latin America, through the Cartagena Declaration of 1984, is looking at a more, a wider definition of who is a refugee, and therefore some countries like Colombia, Brazil, and others do recognize Venezuelans as refugees. This means that people from Venezuela, after they apply for asylum, are basically exposed to a policy of detention of deportation, meaning they can always be deported, so detained, and then deported to Venezuela, meaning they live in isolation and in fear. Because any kind of movement, they can be arrested, they can be detained, and eventually deported to Venezuela. No, Aruba, because Aruba is part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, so it's not really part of any kind of a Latin American body agreements, and we do follow, I think, mostly the Netherlands. The other instrument that is relevant for Aruba is really the European Convention for Human Rights. So the Cartagena, unfortunately, is not really affecting the policies of Aruba. There's no registration of the refugees, so there's no real estimate of what the number are, and there's some movements. If we're talking about 17,000 that we estimate that arrived in the last 4 years, you know, at least there's one repatriation/deportation plane that goes out every month. So the estimation is that around 1,000 probably left already. And some boats are arriving lately to Aruba and cross the sea. We don't know really what the numbers are, but we don't estimate that this is a big number. As I said, there's lack of access to basic rights. Asylum seekers in Aruba do not have the right to work. And meaning, I mean, this basically means that there's no real access to health services or any kind of services apart from education, as this is a universal right that Aruba recognizes, and the children are integrated into the schools. This also means that the Venezuelan population is living under extreme amount of stress because of this sense of fear of deportation and isolation, and detention and deportation. And we see quite a lot of detentions and arrests in the last few months. I think in August there was a shooting between 2 Venezuelans in the south, and I think politically the government has decided to show their force and then detain. The conditions in detentions are pretty bad, and I don't know if any of you are aware of the Amnesty Holland report that came out regarding Curaçao last month about the violations of human rights in Curaçao in regards to detention. And the situation in Aruba is not that different, and people can stay quite a long time in detention and without clear view to their ability actually to seek asylum from the detention center. Also, NGOs do not have access to the detention center, but 2 weeks ago the Red Cross has signed an agreement with the government, so hopefully they will be able to visit. Sure.
So what is happening, for example, like people are reaching more, the government tries to push back the way that it's timing, but some of them successfully like arrive in the country, and then how we like if it's not, if you register as asylum seeker, then you're gonna go through this really overwhelming process and it's dangerous for you to be sent back. So how do the NGOs, what are the where do they stay? Like I imagine
No, so this is an interesting question. So at the beginning, people arrived really from all over Venezuela. We had 5 flights from Venezuela from different parts. It was also the cheapest flight out of Venezuela, $100, and you were there. But lately, what we see is that in the last few years, the people who actually come are people from Falcon State, which is just across the sea. And these are people who probably have family there in Aruba, or friends, or used to work there, or were deported and just come back. So they have some kind of a network to survive. And you barely see them in the street. They go to work, which is an informal work, and then, you know, stay at home. But they arrive to us also through word of mouth. When we arrived in 2018, you know, we weren't really welcome. UNHCR, which is the UN Agency for Refugees, and HIAS arrived in 2018. And I think the government was a bit suspicious. You know, another international sort of organizations, bodies are coming, will look at what is happening, and they really could not really appreciate the benefit of having such organizations on the islands. I think today they are quite aware of the importance, especially due to the COVID-19 situation, the pandemic, that hit Aruba economically very hard. And we were there to support not just the Venezuelans, but also other migrants and Arubans. And luckily, HIAS, our offices, and now we opened another community center, is considered a safe space. So, you know, the police will not come and the Guardia Nascosta will not arrest them, and they are safe coming to us. But the situation in general is quite stressful in that sense, and that's why we also see very high levels of stress, of depression, because life is not easy. And people try to fit in, so you know they won't be recognized as Venezuelans, which is not that easy due to language barriers, etc. The other thing is cost of living is very high. Aruba, everything is imported. Aruba doesn't really cultivate anything apart from aloe vera, which you cannot eat, unfortunately. And so everything is really expensive and is imported. The economic crisis during the pandemic hit Aruba hard. Aruba's economy dependent on tourism. Tourism was shut down, so it meant that most Arubans also lost their jobs. Not to mention refugees and migrants who were left in a situation where they can barely sustain themselves in Aruba, let alone support their children or family members back in Venezuela. This is already changing. No further movement from Aruba. There is now movement. We see that people are moving to the US because maybe they don't see a future of integration in Aruba due to this policy. And arrival by boat is extremely dangerous. We had a boat with 19 people capsized last year. Boats on the way to Curacao also capsized. So this has a lot of risk, not just because of the sea, but also the risk of trafficking and smuggling of people. These are boats that are also used to smuggle arms, contraband, exotic animals, drugs. So, you know, it's pretty tough. Yes, sure.
Because Aruba is under the administration of the Netherlands, you said that it also abides to European law. So in Europe, for example, Greece has executed illegal pushbacks. And I'm pretty sure this is going to bring light in court and stuff, and I hope we lose for this like inhuman behavior. But what about Aruba? Because it's also illegal basically.
So at the moment, part of the assistance that the Netherlands was giving Aruba and Curacao for the response to the Venezuela situation went, a lot of it went into sort of military and border patrol funding. And this is the Dutch Navy that is doing all the patrols. So at the end of the day, it's actually the Netherlands who will be involved if it is proven that there are pushbacks. At the moment, there's no proof of pushbacks, and I don't know if pushbacks are really happening. And also, as I said, the movement is small. By sea, it's really small. It's nothing compared to what you see in the Mediterranean. So Aruba was, HIAS Aruba was established in February 2019. Today we have 21 staff members with an office in Oranjestad, and now we opened another community center, especially to respond to this life in isolation and the mental health stresses. The need to really come together, comfort each other, come up with solutions together, really base the whole assistance on a community approach. We also provide CBI, which is cash-based initiatives and training in Curacao, and we are providing now remote services in cash-based intervention, mental health and psychosocial assistance, and economic integration in the Northern Caribbean, mainly Bahamas, Saint Martin, and Turks and Caicos. This is something that we are just began in October. And our main donors are PRM, this is the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration in the US State Department, and UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. We've seen that. So what do we do? So the main issue is really the issue of assisting protection measures. What we do is try to identify the most vulnerable families or individuals, and together with them try to mitigate any risks to their safety, to their dignity, and to their well-being. So basically we have a network of social workers who identify the needs, work together through case management with the refugees themselves, how to mitigate these issues, and we do that through various services. We provide financial assistance, we provide psychosocial assistance, and then food vouchers, education vouchers to register to school, and also medical vouchers to cover some of the medical needs. We do a lot of coordination meetings and case management with other NGOs, mainly the international one, which are UNHCR, IOM, but also the Red Cross. And slowly with government agency, it took time to sort of get us in and gain the trust. And we do a lot of advocacy work, and you have to understand that Aruba is a small island. Imagine it's 110,000 people. I don't know, compare in Holland what it is. I don't know what's the size of Groningen or something like that, on a piece of land. And so you can imagine government agencies, NGOs are usually led by one person for decades and decades. Everything is very personalized. Nothing is really systemized. It's all about who you know, who you don't speak to, who you're angry with, who went to school with you. And that's how things operate. And it's really difficult as an international sort of body to come and make any changes, especially when you're an outsider. Although most of our staff is Aruban, I mean, all our staff is Aruban, I'm the only foreigner, it's quite difficult to lead any kind of changes, and it's really important to gain allies and really support local civil society. And I think, you know, when we talk, especially with counterparts here in Holland, it's sometimes amazing that, you know, the Dutch Foreign Ministry is really a leader in pushing and promoting and mainstreaming mental health issues in development, or, you know, access to rights, LGBTI rights. But when it comes to the other sort of countries within the kingdom, there's no such approach, and it's missing. Yes, I understand that in the kingdom, every territory has to be sort of equal, but I think there needs to be a greater dialogue and support for local civil society, both in Curaçao and in Aruba. And we are in a catch-22 situation where most NGOs are formed by, you know, 2-3 people. They don't really have the capacity to run projects, to get serious funding. And then international NGOs like us or IOM or UN sort of comes in, and we can, you know, we're in a more powerful position, and I think our responsibility is really try and support through our support, but also support the development of local civil society, local NGOs, that local capacity will increase as well. We are trying to work now after 2 years of direct assistance, which was operated in a mode of emergency, to try and support a more community-based approach, a more sustainable approach to the protection of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. And we do that through a community center that we just established. We work with community mobilizers to spread and provide information about rights. We have, really, the refugees have all the profiles. You have doctors, you have lawyers, you have simple workers, skilled and unskilled people, and they are working themselves. We have approached the University of Aruba. We are trying now to set up a refugee rights clinic. The refugees themselves approached us, and together with the University of Aruba, now they are translating relevant legislation into Spanish, so refugees will know their rights and could support themselves and defend themselves eventually. We provide courses and activities, especially language, papiamento, Dutch, English, also financial literacy, entrepreneurial skills, etc. And are really trying to also offer space for any kinds of community-based initiatives. For instance, there's a Venezuelan NGO that works with people living with HIV. So we provide them a space. We provide support for these organizations to come and self-organize. Another issue we are working we have a focus on is the issue of gender-based violence. In 2021, we already identified 42. Overall, in 2 years, we identified 80 Venezuelan women and men who are survivors. The main issue is that Aruba lacks any clear protocols for response to survivors of gender-based violence, and this is not just for migrants, but this is also for Arubans. And here, really, our challenge was how to get civil society to support and provide pressure on government and other agencies to change the legislation, develop protocols, and really support a change and create a national dialogue on the issue, because at the end of the day, this is not a migrant situation. This is a situation that affects everybody. Migrant women are much more vulnerable because of issues of dependency, dependent relations on local men, lack of employment, which means that women are vulnerable to recruitment into sex work and also trafficking. We're providing hygiene kits to women and girls, and through that we provide information about gender-based violence. We use what is called violent thermometer, where you can actually analyze yourself, your situation, and through that quite a lot of women approach us, and not just us, but also Aruban organizations that support survivors. We provide training and capacity building, we have support groups, and now we are starting a program on positive masculinity. But again, it feels a bit of a challenge and a bit of a conflict that an international NGO working with migrants is actually leading these kind of changes or supporting these kind of issues, while leadership from within the country is not really there. But I hope that our efforts will create a momentum for such change. Another issue is mental health and psychosocial assistance. We provide individual and group assistance, either by counseling or support groups. We do activities on the beach so people can have some recreational ability, and we also refer to partners if we are talking about professional issues, professional services like psychiatric services, etc. In general, Aruba has declared a situation of mental health crisis because of the pandemic, which is something that is unfortunately probably common to many, many countries. It's just that Aruba really lacks the professional skills in terms of quantity and resources in terms of psychologists, psychiatrists, and professional staff. Economic inclusion, this is something we started in 2021 with 40 households. And this is, I think, a real challenge. How do you support individuals and their entrepreneurial initiatives when they informally cannot really take part or play a part in the formal economy. We were quite amazed by the response, by the ingenuity, and by the fact that luckily through social media you can do quite a lot today, and you can reach out to people, and I think it was quite encouraging, and we will continue to do that next year as well. As I said, the COVID-19 was a challenge, but for us it was real opportunity. When the pandemic started, the government asked us to, basically we were used, or we provided services as a channel for information about the COVID to Spanish-speaking population through our Facebook page, through WhatsApp groups, etc. As I said, we had to scale up our mental health and psychosocial services because of the needs from the community. We are probably the principal organization providing some medical coverage of some medical care, but if you have any kind of a serious condition or anything of or a chronic situation, or you have to be hospitalized, then we unfortunately cannot cover that, and people get into debt agreement with the hospital to pay that. We are extremely concerned about refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants with HIV that at the moment are not really integrated, which puts them at risk for their lives and also the community. So we at the moment are supporting financially just for the purchase of medication, but this is not a long-term solution, and we are advocating with the government to include them as well. We're supporting the registration of children to school, as I said, response to the increase in gender-based violence, and we played a pivotal role in facilitation of the access to vaccination to COVID-19, because what happened, funds were coming from the Netherlands for universal vaccination, but what happened was that people who didn't have a status on the island did not come. They didn't want to enter any kind of official or government spaces in fear of detention. And together with the Ministry of Health, we offered them then to do the registration at the highest offices, and this has created this facilitated a huge increase in the vaccination rate. And I think before our engagement, maybe 1,000 people without status on the island vaccinated, and after that we reached, I think, around 8,000. So it was quite an important move, which also built quite a lot of trust between us as a mediator between the population and the government. This is our team. This is partially, we grew quite a bit in the last 2 months. You see, Aruba is very diverse, especially our gardener with this bandana. Yeah, there are still quite a lot of gaps, especially in the issues of education and education for teenagers, the issue of access to health, child protection, the necessary legislations that need to be developed, and alternative pathways for regularization and access to employment, which brings us to the assessment that AEclipse conducted in Aruba, and this is why we approached them, because the future, at the end of the day, the only sustainable future is to look at pathways of economic integration of the Venezuelans into the labor market. And when we approached the private sector, they told us, hey, we need some facts, we need some evidence, we need some research, so we can base our advocacy on that. And I think this is an amazing opportunity to combine research, practical programming, and advocacy based on a real need. And we will be using the assessment and develop it as an advocacy tool to do that. And I would say that just in the last few weeks, we see a change in discourse by the government. They are talking about integration of Venezuelan into the local labor market because of recovery and the need for workers, especially in the construction sector and the hotel sector. And they are looking at ways to legalize some of these Venezuelans, and I think this is a great way forward. This is an opportunity, I think, for all of us, and that will offer some kind of a sustainable future for those that are there and will probably stay there for years. Because unfortunately, I don't see any changes in the situation in Venezuela in the next few years. So I will stop now. If you have any questions, if not, I will give the floor to Idan and Feme to continue. Thank you. This is just our experience.
Okay, well, thank you, Yiftach. I think that was very interesting, and I think also the complexity of the situation, how you described it, is important here, because Fem and I will explain the research, but also how these 6 months were really like a learning process for us. And yeah, I think you explained very well in these last 40 minutes how complex is the situation. And with this presentation, yeah, we want to show you how we collected the data, etc., but also to show you how it was challenging and rewarding for us as students to do this. But Fem, I'll let you continue.
Yeah, so I'll start a bit more about the actual research we did. First off, a bit about AEclipse and IRP in general. I guess you all know, but AEclipse is the Master Study Association at ESE, representing students in policy economics, international economics, and economics of markets and organizations. AEclipse has a few flagship events, of which IRP is one. So every year we have a committee that organizes a research project in a developing country. Previous years they went to Argentina, Russia, Zambia, and this year we went to Aruba. And we always work together with a research partner. So this year we started off the research project with a committee of 6 students. We started looking into different research topics and possible partners until Idan came into contact with HIAS. We had a Zoom meeting and concluded that was going to be our partner for the year. So from January onwards, we started recruiting more people, all other master students who were studying economics, law, political science, development and migration. And we call them the consultants, and they assisted us throughout the research in the months afterwards. We reached out to Professor Olivier Marie, who is an economist focusing on labor, and he was so kind to assist us throughout the research. As I said, we had multiple meetings through Zoom, where we met Yiftach, but also Oscar Lee, another member of the HIAS Aruba team. And we met Galo and Adriana, who are part of the economic inclusion team of HIAS. Furthermore, we were introduced to Rendel de Kort, who is an economist at the World Bank, and he assisted us throughout the research as well as some students from the University of Aruba, who mainly helped with the research on the island because they were fluent in Spanish, Papiamento, English, and a bit of Dutch, so that was really, really helpful. So now the part that we are probably the most interested in, the research. So the goal of the research was to have a labor market assessment on the island, and we wanted to see where there would be opportunities for the employment of the forcibly displaced Venezuelans on the island. And in the end, we wanted to have some recommendations for the government and the private sector on how to best decide on topics related to this. So before Idan's going to talk more about the research, I first wanted to say something about how we set it up. So we had 3 research teams. As I said, we wanted to do a labor market assessment. So we had one team, the blue team, focusing on that. And then we had the yellow and green team, which took care of the economic, social, and legal aspects. And we wanted these teams to kind of support the results we would find in the labor part. So now on to Idan.
Thank you. So I will continue with the research itself. So the first bit of research we did was a capacity assessment. This was a short 1-month research that we conducted before the final report. We did that one exclusively from Rotterdam. So we collected only information that was available online. The idea here was just to provide a general overview of what is the situation on the island today. So we delved into mostly 3 things. First one is the economic consequences of COVID, so in different industries and sectors, but also on the economy in general. Then we looked at the status of the labor markets. Here we only focused on the Aruban labor market itself. We could not find information about Venezuelans yet. But so we looked into demographics and the structure of the labor markets in general. And we also looked into the legal apparatus, so the framework that's is linked to entering Aruba as a migrant. So what are the steps that you have to undertake, etc. So the data we used for this part, as I said, is only what was available online. So we used papers and research from institutes based in Aruba, such as the Central Bank of Aruba, the CBS of Aruba, the Department of Economic Affairs, but then also information from international organizations such as the World Bank, the IMF, or the UNHCR. The main finding we found with this first assessment is the impact that COVID had and how serious it was. As Yiftach mentioned before already, the island's economy is based on tourism. We found it's about 70% of the GDP is tourism. And so the limit of global travels was very, very serious for the island. This is really what we realized, okay, this is going to be quite complex. But there was also a conclusion for our own team, and that is that there was not much information available online, that we'll have to collect data ourselves, especially regarding the Venezuelan community. So we decided to send a team of 5 delegates to Aruba to conduct field research. So there were 2 goals here. On one hand, we wanted to collect our own data, but also we wanted to get insights on the island and understand how things work there. So also collaborating further with HIAS Aruba and with the University of Aruba. So it was really this combination of two missions. And we conducted 5 different studies, and I'll go through them one by one. So first, interview data. We interviewed about 20 stakeholders for between 1 and 2 hours. And the stakeholders can be more or less divided into 2 kinds. We had people from the private sector, so industry leaders. Here we interviewed people who were in charge of industry associations, so associations that represent various companies within each industry. And so by speaking with them, we could have a big picture of what every industry looks like, what kind of employment they were needed, what kind of skills were required for the various companies of these industries. So specifically, we looked into tourism, food and beverage, and construction, and a few more, I think. Then, for the public sector, we spoke with various departments from the government and from governmental agencies, such as economic departments, legal departments, and statistical agencies. And it's important to mention also that we had strong assistance from our colleagues in Rotterdam for this. So they helped us prepare the interviews, but also once they were conducted, we were able to send it to them so they could analyze and derive the important information from it. So then the skills survey. Here we wanted to collect data about the characteristics of the Venezuelan population in Aruba. So the focus was on the skills, the education, and the past employment of the Venezuelan population, but we also were able to ask questions about general characteristics such as the family size or their financial situation in Aruba in general. We were able to have 534 respondents, which is quite a significant number given that there's 17,000 Venezuelans in Aruba, so that's about 3% of the population. We can speak of a few sample selection biases because the skills survey was conducted through HIAS, so their own network is not the entire 17,000 Venezuelans, but mostly people who are seeking for help. So it was actually mostly women and more vulnerable people, so there's that kind of bias. And then another bias worth mentioning is snowball sampling, yeah. And that is that basically, because it was shared through social media, every person who responded then shared it to another person. So it could be that many people were interconnected within the respondents. So that's that. But then here are a few of our findings from the skills survey. So the top right graph, are you willing to work during weekends, yes or no? That's one of our most important findings. We see that 96% of the Venezuelans said that they are willing to work in weekends. And we'll speak later about why is this important. About the education level, we see that more than 50% of Venezuelans went to university, and then a larger share did get the diploma, but then still a significant share did not. And we see also that a big part went to high school but had no diploma. In terms of current employment, we see that on the island, more than 50% have casual jobs, but also a big share are currently unemployed. So this is also confirms what Yiftach was describing. And then in terms of legal status, we see that almost 50% are asylum seekers, almost 40% are undocumented, and then this again puts numbers really on the narrative that Yiftach was explaining here. None of the shares in the last circle were actual refugees, so it's all kinds of different things, but no one is properly documented here. So then another type of study we had was a focus group. So these are qualitative research methods. So what we did here is that we invited two groups of Venezuelan migrants. We had one group of women and one group of men, and we asked them questions. Here the focus was mainly on the legal aspects, and so we wanted to understand how do they perceive the legal system. So we conducted this in Spanish, and luckily our main legal analyst was also a Spanish speaker, so that worked out quite well. Then two more. We had the Q study. Here the goal was to try to have an understanding of the public opinion of Arubans on the situation of Venezuelan migrants. So what we did is that we had to pick at random about 20 Arubans. So we went to cafes, to bars, in the streets, at people's houses, and asked them to conduct this, share information with us. So what we asked them to do was to rank statements that we gave them from -5, so strongly disagree, to +5, strongly agree. And then with this ranking, we were able to get a table that was then sent to one of our consultants who was specializing in that, and he was then able to make a data analysis of this table and to categorize people into different narratives. So we, in total, had 4 narratives. And this is quite important because xenophobia plays a big role into the difficult employment opportunities of Venezuelans. And so to be able to show this with data was also a big step. And then finally, the business survey. So we conducted a survey online of companies from Aruba. And here, well, we had already insights from the directors of the industry associations, but we wanted to confirm those insights with additional data from the companies. So we asked them to fill in this online form where they would explain how did they cope with COVID, but also the skill requirements that their companies needed or the employment gaps that they were facing. And so, as I said, this was more like confirming the insights we had from the interviews already. And I will give the floor back to Fema.
Yeah, so now more about the findings. So we already talked a bit more, about the skill survey. In general, we found that not a lot of kids were enrolled in school. And as Yiftach already said, the status of migrants is problematic. Lots of them are undocumented, and they are not recognized as refugees. Regarding education and skills, we see that almost all of the respondents are fluent in Spanish. However, they're not very proficient in English, Papiamento, and almost none of them speak Dutch. Regarding education, Idan already mentioned this, and training experience was mainly focused on financial administration, education, cleaning, trade, retail, and wholesale, and construction. And what is important to mention is that for employment, 98% of the respondents work without contracts. They are very willing to work, especially also during weekends, in evenings, and during holidays, which we'll come back to later, which is a very important part of our findings. As we mentioned before, COVID-19 had a pretty big impact also on these people. And we see that many people are overqualified for the jobs that they are performing. So we see that, as I mentioned before, there's a high willingness of this group of people to work during weekends, evenings, and holidays. And this is very important, seeing that the Arubans themselves rather not work at these times and days. They were much more fond of their 9-to-5 job and really want their evenings and weekends to be free. So here, and of course in a hotel or in restaurants, there is demand for people that work these times. So there seems to be a match between the labor demand and supply here. However, in the hotel, timeshare, and restaurants, we see that there are requirements for certain skills and also for languages. So in hotels, you would need to have proficiency in English, and also the skills, for example, like IT, accountants, those kind of skills are needed, but we see that there is quite a big gap between the skills of the respondents and the demands of the market. For the construction sector, experience and language skills are less important. The people we spoke to indicated that as long as the people have the right documentation, they can just learn on the job and learn as they go. So this could be a more easily accessible opportunity. So yeah, quite some opportunities, but also some barriers. We would need to overcome the skills and the language skills, and the lack of them, and the legal status of the migrants. So the conclusion is that there is actually a win-win situation possible for the Aruban government. And the solution all starts with registration of these people. Because as long as once they are registered, they can work legally and can really get into the labor market of Aruba. And because we now see that there are quite some industries where there are problems with finding people to fill their vacancies. And as there are people that are willing to work to fill these vacancies, registration would be a good first step to actually bridge this gap. Also, if we would register the forcibly displaced migrants, this would lead to more fair competition on the market, less exploitation of the workers, and the government would be able to get income through taxes that they would pay. In the end, we wrote down, I think, 13 recommendations, but these are the 5 that are most important or good to discuss, I think, of which the first, of course, is the registration of the Venezuelans, which I explained before. But then also the promotion of the Arubans and the migrant population that are already on the island. So really try to give those two groups, the people that are already there, try to really integrate them into the labor market before getting other people from other places to fill jobs. Then provision of English and vocational training, and also the reforming of the labor market. Right now, the labor market the laws are quite strict, and making them more flexible would allow for easier hiring and firing of people. And lastly, we would need promotion of sympathy towards the Venezuelan population. As Idan mentioned before, there's quite some xenophobia, and we would need to overcome this in order for this to really work. There's also been some research done on this. And we will discuss this a bit later as well. But we see that there's no evidence of adverse effects of an inflow of migrants on the employment rates and wages. There's been research done by David Card, who is one of the Nobel Prize winners this year, and he investigated the inflow of migrants from Cuba in Miami in the 1980s, and he indeed already also found this result and concluded this. So it seems to be that there is some promising things out there.
Okay, and so for the last slides, we call it here the contingency of field research. And what we're trying to say here is that in the end, for our findings, many things were dependent on our situation in Aruba, maybe on a bit of luck. And we want to express this with you. So the first thing we want to say is that conducting field research is challenging. For our team, no one has been to Aruba before. No one had studied the country before. So it was, as I was saying just before we started, it was a very intense learning process for us. And it was a very complex situation that we were entering. But what we want to stress here as well is that this variety and complexity should be embraced. And what we mean by this is best explained with an example. So Rick and Fema had various interviews with industry leaders, and day after day they would come back to us, because in the evening we would meet together with the team and discuss our findings of the day. And they would explain, yeah, it seems like they are saying, yeah, Arubans are lazy and are not willing to work in the evening and the weekend, but they suspect that the Venezuelans are. And okay, they explained this once, twice, 3 times, and then eventually we realized maybe it's good to add this question in the survey. And the day before we sent the survey, we added this question, and that's how we got one of our most important data, that is 96% of Venezuelans are willing to work in weekends. And this was not a matter of luck, but it was something that we learned about during our stay there, and we were learning day by day, and we were able to incorporate this into our survey to get actual data out of it. And this is to say, yeah, maybe there's a matter of luck as well. And that's just a message maybe for the students around, to say that in your own careers, you might be asked to perform research as well. And you have to be able to accept this and try to embrace it if you can. That's what we're trying to say. So you could ask, are these findings fragile given the luck that we had in finding them? Well, possibly, but at the same time, I think our team is very proud of what we did, and we see it as a stepping stone nonetheless, because no research was conducted on the topic before us. And so in that sense, we're very happy. And I think this concludes our part. So I don't know if there's any questions for Fem and myself. Okay. Well,
just because people are students who don't have much knowledge. It's difficulty of the conducting, research evaluations. It's always a bit problematic, but as you said, I think we start and people are where there's lack of data, there's lack of research, there's almost not much work. So, anything like this is really a stepping stone, for next level, for another level, and
I think this concludes very well our part.
Should I go straight
Professor,
away?
you can go ahead.
Okay. Got my slides here. Use this. Hello. Yes. Thank you. So I'm happy to be here. I was very interested. So I did not know much about the IRP and the rest. And then they contacted me, telling me what it was all about. Actually, I had sent them my colleague last year to do the last round, so I knew a little bit about it. But since I do work on labor, and especially on the economics of migration, I have some papers on that. I'm going to mention them towards the end of this. We're going to actually zoom back and see what does economics say about migration, and then zoom in a bit on my research. I got nothing about Aruba, sorry, because data is lacking. So maybe now. No, I was really shocked to learn of the size of the migrant population, because I'll show you some migrant population in different moments in the US, for example, that never reaches these levels. So it's a very difficult context. But it would be very interesting to do some research. And 110 is about the size of Maastricht, which is, I think Groningen is slightly smaller. Because there was a big issue of foreigners in Maastricht, but because of the borders more. So I've studied that as well. Okay, so what's interesting is, you've studied economics, a lot of you. Oh, and I need to do some advertising. This is the next block. I have a course with this in it, which is labor. So if you're in year 3, you should sign up for it. And I also teach it for the future PhD student. I teach labor and I teach migration. This is a very simplified version, but let's go in there. Okay, so you must have studied trade flows in economics, how much things move from one country and another, but mostly you talk about goods, import, export. And so it's the great absentee of the globalization era. So we make a lot of easy rules for transporting goods, but we should make it easier, and the European Union has tried within, but not outside, so creating a lot of issues. So those barriers to trade have been taken away, but cross-border worker flows are very restricted, and it's actually a bit new, we'll see, but not so new. So between 1820 to 1940, for example, about 60 million Europeans moved to the US. I mean, that was the biggest moments of migration ever. Okay, so this is all of France going to the US, but over a bit more than a century. Today, it's Europe who's extracting more people than the US in total numbers. Okay, so the century of migration is still called the 1800s. We'll see the 2000s, a lot of movements happening now, but the 1900s were less of a movement because of all those restrictions. And it started, so 36 million migrants came from, if you didn't know, the biggest minority in the US is Germans that arrived in terms of number. And there's a very interesting thoughts you can make is that when they voted on deciding what was going to be the language in the US at the national level, English won by 1 vote versus German. So they were deciding on which one to vote for, but there were so many Germans in the colonies that they voted, and some people have actually written nice books where it would be German and the Second World War happens. What would have happened, with all this happening? That's kind of a nice idea, but okay, it's English, it's happening. And very quickly, if you don't know, it's also a very Protestant country. So from the first very anti-movement was anti-Catholics, and because the Italians, the Poles who arrived after the English and the Scandinavians were Catholics, so there was a big anti-Catholic movement, not as official as it became very quickly for the Asians. So there was actually anti-Asian, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1900s was one of the first really written down, no more Chinese can enter the country, they're stealing our jobs. So you can see this is not a new issue. And then officially anti-migration quota, so the very first quotas that existed, I'm talking about the US because there's more literature a bit on that, and it's easier, it's one big block. And 1920, Anti-Immigration Act, 1924, they really started to enact this, okay? To really say, okay, we got to stop the migrants coming. And then they started on quota systems from the 60s, and they were updated regularly, okay? And then you have other bans which are very recent, which are a bit hard to be constitutional. He was saying it's not anti-Muslim, but you can see the countries which were banned, it's clearly an anti-Muslim ban. Okay, so this is not new, but also it's still very, very current, and I'll show you some things like that. So just to give you an idea of how many people have arrived, so this is the share of the population. So about 1% of the population arrived every year in the 1850s. That's quite a lot for the US, but compared to not so much. Of course, in absolute number, there's actually more arriving today, but because the US is much bigger, it's a smaller percentage, right? Okay. So what are we talking about? In a way, this is a bit to bring it back to real economics rather than history that we've just discussed a little bit, is that often it's the first come, first served basis. So if you arrive first, you're first in the list. And when it's easy to enter, you enter, and then it becomes harder and harder. But nowadays, I won't mention it too much, it's in the class, but countries use a point system. So if you speak the right language, so a lot of Haitians go to Canada, there's a huge community, because they speak French. And Quebec puts you like top of the list if you speak French, because they're so English, so worried about the British that it's actually very good. So you advise anyone, I would advise the Venezuelans to speak French, and then they could go to Canada, because Spanish is not so valued in those countries. So there's a lot of ways of measuring how difficult it is to get. So admissions procedure and length of permits, years of procedures to become a citizen. There's also rules for asylum seekers. Most of what I'm going to talk is going to be is for economic migrants, but asylum seekers, sometimes economic migrants, very hard to disentangle. So it can apply to both. And we'll see in Europe, migration policies are getting a bit stricter. And at the same time, enforcement is not great. So this creates a dual thing, so they become stricter, and the stricter you get, more people are going to be likely to enter illegally. So you create a vicious circle almost, if you don't give people big reasons to come in, okay? So some estimate it's about 10 to 40% of all migrants that are in Europe are there illegally, okay? But we'll see what people think and what is the reality on that in a slide, okay? Just to give you an idea, so some nice places. This is an Italian organization with very smart people who kind of do a scale of how difficult it is to get into a country based on those things, you know, how long you get the permit, all those things, number of years to obtain a permit. And just what I want to show you, okay, these are the nice numbers, actual numbers, but this is nice. It's a bit old, I need to update the slide, but you can see how difficult it is to get in various countries. And since this is the 45-degree line, this is how difficult it was in 1990, and this is how difficult it was in 2005. This has changed a lot in the last 15 years. We need to update this as well, but what you see, it's all above the 95-degree line, so it's all becoming stricter. Okay, so this is, the higher you are, the more difficult it is. And surprisingly, people think French is tough, but it's actually why? Because it's very easy to become French. Okay, so relative to some other, so for example, the Netherlands would go up because they moved some, you could be 5 years here and get permanent residence, and now they moved to 7 and to 10. Okay, the 7th thing is interesting because it created a lot of problems for PhD students. We had a lot of PhDs from Turkey or other countries who were very happy after 5 years they could become citizens. But now we have to extend, they said, can you extend 1 year, 2 year, 3 year my contract so I can become a citizen at the same time, which a PhD is normally 4 or 5 years. So it becomes a bit interesting, but there are nice studies about the impact of getting nationality or not on your probability to integrate. So in Germany, for example, they made it easier for children to become natives, to become German straight away or not, and this changed sharply, so you can do some nice studies. But I'll mention some ideas of nice studies. So. Yeah, I don't want to talk, yeah, migration policies were not always so strict. Now it's become strict, okay? What I want to talk about is the second part here. So perceptions versus reality. So one thing which is interesting is natives tend to really overestimate the number of immigrants, if you ask them. Even when they arrived, do you know when there was the highest number of immigrants that ever arrived in the Netherlands, which year? Any ideas, anyone? Give me a year. Indonesia was quite a few, but they very slowly they arrived. The big arrival, one big peak was the arrival more from Suriname. Okay, that was all in 1 year. But that was all in 1 year, but still it's small. Highest number of migrants arriving? No, 70s, 60s, 50s, 20s, 30s, no, no? 2018, 17, 18. It's actually much more arriving now. Of course, it's because we count all the EU migrants that arrive, and there was huge waves arriving from Hungary, Romania, and all that. Okay, so it's interesting to study it right now as well. But there was a big increase there. There's much more negative perceptions during downturn. So you know, unluckily, usually downturns happen everywhere. So when a country's hit in a poor country, it's even worse. So they want to come to the richer sometimes, so they get attracted. Actually, there was a decrease in number of Turkish migrants in the 2010s, negative migration, because the Netherlands wasn't doing well and Turkey was doing very well. So it's kind of interesting. They moved back, some of them. But also people really, and I'm going to talk, I do a lot of research on crime, so I'm going to mention a bit crime at the end. The problem is people don't really only think about the labor market, you know, the jobs, but they also think about fiscal cost. Oh, migrants cost a lot on the, to the health system in terms of benefits. So there's a lot of discussion of closing the benefit door. Saying, no, you can come in, and actually in the Netherlands, when you come in, you have to sign a paper if you bring someone foreign, that they will not use any of the benefits for at least 5 years. Some stuff like this, okay? My wife is Brazilian, and I had to sign this when I arrived here from the UK. I was pretty shocked, but they say, look, your wife cannot use anything for the first 5 years of living in the Netherlands. I was like, whoa, okay, I didn't know. But so there's a big of discussion on that, but of course, integration and cutting, like not giving the same rights of people is a bit complicated. Okay, so let's see some stuff. What people worry most about immigration. Immigrants increase crime, immigrants steal jobs, immigrants increase taxes. And those numbers are pretty scary, yeah? This is the percentage who say yes. And as you can see, that's why I want to bring in the fiscal and crime issues, is that really, these are huge, always bigger than the other ones, except in the US, where crime and immigrants are not the big issue, but you have to remember they have a really high crime rate among Black Americans, which is more what they would move to. So, but it's quite scary, like the UK, who thinks they are very liberal, all again, but Italy is also about crime a lot. Okay, so a lot of my colleagues. But here's a nice one, is percent of interviewed thinking that most immigrants are illegal present in the country, estimated fraction. So how many do you think that most illegals are in the country? So in Italy, everyone, they said almost everyone is illegal. USA, almost everyone is illegal. So it's really a message. The Dutch do well. Well, it's not exactly comparable, the two numbers, but they are less, it's not a very big, number. And of course, you can see why, here it's pretty easy to become legal as well. So that's why there's not too many illegal. Okay. Okay. So this is also a very interesting one, which was done by researchers who gave randomly some people the number of immigrants in the country and others not, and asked them about what they think about migration, okay? People first informed, so proportional respondent opposed to immigration. And you can see the difference once you inform people about the real number of migrants. Just give them the number. Here are that many numbers in the country. I don't know if that's going to work in Aruba because it's the other way around. They must underestimate the number of immigrants, but you can see, like in Italy, it's quite scary. Yeah? People were 50% opposed to 30%. So just giving information about migration can work great, like real numbers, what's happening. Okay? It's again, the Dutch don't move much, so they're not the best country to study those things relative to things. Okay, let me just, I don't know how much time I have, but let me talk a little bit about, yeah, start at 15, okay. Let me talk about the theory. So in an ideal world, immigrants and natives are complements on the labor market. So they complement each other, so migrants do not compete on the same labor market exactly. Immigrants make natives more productive. Okay, so you bring nurses and the natives are doctors, or vice versa. You have a lot of nurses and you bring some doctors, then they complement each other. So when you have more migrants, there's a big demand for them and everyone becomes richer. So that's kind of the dream, and that's why some people are doing those point system, or we need more people in this, in that, and that. And for Aruba, I think it's maybe this thing of weekend or in this sector. I don't know if you were able to find anything about which sectors they could come in, well, not exactly sectors, but within profession within a sector. It's a bit complicated, but. Okay, but most of the time what people are worried is that they are perfect substitutes, okay? If it's fully elastic, so that's more the flexibility of the labor market you mentioned, making the labor market flexible on wages, for example. What you would see is that wage fully adjusts to changes in labor supply. Of course, we don't think of the long run, but it's much more actually interesting, but it's the short run. Politicians and people think of the short run. Society should think in the long run in a way and say, okay, once you have more people, and if you did this in Macro 101, more people, more growth, because all those things. So normally migration should in the long run be a good thing. But the short run frictions are what people worry about a lot. Okay, and the big worry is that if it's completely inelastic, you have this, okay? What the first graph shows you is the demand, okay, it doesn't change. What we believe, of course, in the long run, this is going to go up. There's going to be more demand there. What happens is that labor supply, big shock, positive shock. Okay? And what you see is the wage should go down completely. But here, there's no unemployment in a perfect labor market. It's just people leave the market because they choose. That's in a perfect. Okay? And then it could be not fully inelastic, but again, it would be, again, a personal choice. But the bigger issue of these is that you have wage floors. The wage used to be like this, right? And now it doesn't move at all. This is like, imagine the minimum wage. It doesn't move at all. And then there's this shock of labor supply. And this difference is how many people are not willing to work. Okay? And you're going to have unemployment being created. Okay, that's the big worry. So the National Front, when I was young in France, the big slogan was 3,000 immigrants, 3,000 unemployed. That was equal. That's all they put on the poster, and they got a lot of votes with that. Super easy. But that's not how it works, because even there, some migrants might not choose to work and some natives, so it's very complicated to know who's in this mix. Okay, here it's just to tell you, even if then there's a small adjustment of the wage, because, okay, let's admit we bring the wage down a little bit, there's still some unemployment in between there and there, you know. But some of it is more pure migrants and the other not. Okay, that's the theory. So it's going to affect a lot of things in theory. We're going to test it in practice and see which one does. Just one more thing in the course what we show you, and I think that's interesting just to get an idea of who migrates, is this decision to migrate. So you do net present value, so you decide to migrate depending on the wage in the foreign country and the wage in the home country. Okay, divided by your discount rate, so how much you value the future or not. Okay, and that depends on the time you have to. So TE is the time to retirement. So the first one, of course, means that WF wage in the destination country have to be higher than in the wage in the home country for the people. Okay, so of course this could go up or this could go down. So that's going to capture a lot of things, and also depending on your own skills. I'm going to come back to this one. This is where you see a lot of young people migrate, because you need to bring back the cost of migration. Okay, older people maybe have 5 years of good work years, so they wouldn't migrate. The discount rate, that's why there's a lot of nice paper nowadays trying to see of the risk attitude of migrants, because you expect migrants to be more risk takers. Okay, less scared and be, you know, but maybe not, because also the theory will tell you they also value. They're ready to bear a cost today to get more tomorrow. And this is the big important front-loaded migration cost. It's very simple in this model, but it's just like everything that the cost of migration brings you. For example, the cost of traveling, the danger it takes to travel if it's illegal or anything, the cost of becoming legal. Okay, those costs, that's what you may want to play with a lot administratively. That's what you can do the most about. But think about also this language, learning a new language being far away. So that's why you would see a lot of migrants from the same country going in the same country. Okay, and also what you believe your returns are for what's happening. Why are people crossing the channel to go to the UK? And they could stay in France and clean there and go there. So maybe it's because of those different costs they perceive, at least in the UK, or the probability that they're going to have better earnings in one side or the other. And those costs could be reduced from having communities around you. Okay, so all this is possible in there. So this is more human capital decision to invest. So we discussed this a lot in the course. One final thing about the theory, before I show you a couple of small papers that test it. So this is nice. This is where to migrate. So this is, should I migrate or not? So of course, if this is larger than 0, I'm going to migrate because I have more to gain than to lose. Now, which country should I go to? Should I go to 1 or to 2? And this is the skill level of people, and this is the wage I'm going to get for the skill level. So I'm highly educated, not so highly educated. Okay? Country 1 is the US, high levels of inequality. Okay? Country 2 is the Netherlands, very flat wage distribution because of maybe even minimum wages, but we'll talk about this in a second. But migrants would choose which, so what you should see is a lot of high skilled migrants in the US, but choosing to go to the US rather than here. Okay, because here you're more likely to, if you have a high skill level, you're more likely to make money in the US. And here, if you have a low skill level, you're going to go to country 2. But that's, so distribution of migrants can be very different because of the returns to the skills. But what's very nice is that's why you got to, that's why we discuss a lot in the course wage floors, so minimum wage and things like that. is that now imagine the US has a minimum wage, which they're pushing for. Maybe that's going to change the distribution. So from D to B, people are going to the US because the minimum wage is there. Then they go to 2, down to the Netherlands, and then they go back to the US. Okay, so you're going to have a U-shaped distribution. So it's kind of a small models, but which can bring a lot on what's happening in the real world. Okay, skill composition of migrants. These are interesting, but like these are the worst. I mean, I show them as examples of bad correlation given for causation. So if you want to tell someone, look, migrants are good for employment, complete negative relationship between share of foreign number of migrants and unemployment rate. It's negative. So migrants reduce unemployment. Yes? Or is it reverse causality? So migrants choose to go to countries where there is low unemployment rate because they want to find jobs. So it's a bad example, but it's kind of very interesting. So that's why causality is hard to get. So the small examples I'm going to give you use very specific experiments which enable you to get causality. What's more, what you did correlations, of course, is that the rate of unemployment of natives and foreigners, actually what you can see is most countries, a lot of countries, they're less unemployed than the foreigners. I mean, some others, they are more unemployed. Sometimes it's exactly the same. But what you can see is, of course, you see the US, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, for example, down here. Why? Because they have flexible labor markets. They attract high skilled migrants who are less likely to be employed. Okay? You see the level of employment in Spain in both cases. Okay. There's also nice papers about inequality and unemployment. So if you bring, what's interesting is if you relatively bring more low-skilled migrants, the low-skilled wage will decrease and inequality will increase. It's a bit of a worry, and that's why actually trade unions who are very left-wing have always been very dodgy about migration. You know, trade unions are very much defending the worker, and they want to defend the migrant worker, but maybe not to a point. Because the migrant worker might bring down the wage of their own members. So we discussed trade unions in the course as well, because they're very interesting in this dichotomy. They're not sure what to do with the migrants, okay? So, and it's also the insider-outsider issue of trade unions. I'm inside, you're outside, and new migrants, we don't know what to do. But if you bring a lot of high-skilled migrants, actually, you might reduce inequality. Because you have a lot of doctors, you don't have to pay doctors as much. You have to pay nurses, you help the doctors more. Okay? Okay. This is the empirical findings. I'm going to go, I know I don't have too much time. This is a nice little graph about Italy, about migrants and greasing the wheels. So what's nice is that immigrants, change in migration patterns of native workers. So basically substitution even at the area level. So what you see here is, for example, in Italy, negative, in black is the number of natives who've moved, and this is negative, very negative. Those southern regions have lost tons of population. But they gain migrants. Of course, the migrants follow the money. So there you have gained money because it's people going from there to there, right? But the migrants also repopulate those areas. They're the ones who produce all your tomatoes that you eat everywhere. Only migrants in all those areas, okay? Oh no, not the Dutch ones. The good ones. Okay, I'm happy that you mentioned the study by David Card. It's in 1980 that it happened, but the paper is from 1990, so be careful on the reference. So yeah, David got the Nobel Prize this year. If you didn't know what happened, is that Fidel decided in 1980, I'm going to open the borders and I'm going to let everyone go who wants to go. If you want to go, take the boat lift. It's called the Mariel boat lift, okay? And you can go, and the closest place to go, of course, is Miami, one of the big cities, the closest big city. If you've seen Scarface, this is the Scarface, exactly. So what? Because he also opened the prisons. So there was kind of a negative selection and a very positive one at the same time. But he opened the prisons and he pushed all the prisoners on the boats as well. It's known, okay? So there was a lot of mix of people, but he didn't expect so many to go. Then he closed it again. He said, okay, I'm going to close 125,000 just left, okay? Miami's labor force, if you calculate, 7% more people arriving who can work suddenly. That's a huge move to the right, right? So what he argues in his 1990 paper is that, oh, who should I compare? I'm going to compare So it's very similar to the labor market of Miami, then Atlanta, Houston, and Los Angeles. He doesn't have perfect data. What you would want is to know who is likely to be substituted. So low skilled versus low skilled. He argues, David, oh, I'm gonna use Black Americans because on average they have low skills as the control group, right? So that's why it's very important in Aruba. I was happy about your thing about the weekends, working on weekends, but how many Arubans are likely to say yes to that? Did you have the question? Because we don't know, maybe it's 50 or is it 90? I don't know. They argue. But so then he complains it to Black Americans. It's been like one of the biggest papers on smart in terms of this. But I want to bring you back from another big guy in migration who often advocates the other way around, but he's a good researcher. He's in Harvard, so one is in Berkeley, the other. It's Borjas, who recently got hold of much better data and said, look, I think this is not the right people who are going to get substituted in the Miami labor market. In the Miami labor market, you have to look at school dropouts, which you have a lot of. They can be white, they can be Hispanics, they can be anything. They're the ones who are likely to suffer from the arrivals. Okay? So then he looks at the boat lift and he looks at in the paper a few years ago, 2017. What he sees is a massive drop in the employment rate, the weekly wage here. In those other cities using exactly the same things, but using a different control group. So for your thing, it would be known to exactly who are the ones who are likely to be. Okay, so he finds a big impact. So what I want to just say is, you were using the slide by saying, oh, it's done. It's not. There's still a big debate about the impact of that. A lot of people use something that we use. So we have a review paper on the go with my colleague Paolo Pinotti, who's very good on immigration and crime as well. For example, we look at the best evidence on crime, okay? We present estimates here for different countries and different papers. So it's a paper by Paolo, there's the UK, United States, and Chile. On the estimates of the impact of immigration on crime, we have OLS, which is just a regression, which of course is going to be biased, but because of selection and other issues. And I don't want to bring you to this mesh method, but it's called shift share instruments, which a lot of people, which David Carr developed as well, among other people, have used, is that you use the original number of people in the country in each area. For example, how many Moroccans are everywhere in the Netherlands? Okay, exactly. That came a long time ago. And suddenly you have a big wave of Moroccans arriving. They should distribute themselves depending on how many were in the past. It's called, and so the shift is the number depending on the share in the country. These called shift share instruments. They're very nice to do migration stuff. And in those shift share instruments that we use here, for example, let me show you the instruments, there's no impact on immigration and crime. Okay, so are natives reasonably worried? Why are they so worried about immigration and crime? But then I show you another picture, which is very just, this is the number of individuals in prison, the proportion of the foreigners in total population, and the percentage of foreigners in the prison population. And so you see, above the 45-degree line, overrepresented. It's absolutely huge, the overrepresentation, especially in some countries. Again, you have the Anglo-Saxon countries, positive selection. So beyond the selection stories, of course, this is due to selection also, but how can you reconcile this with this one? There's no increase in crime at the area level, but it seems that migrants are much more present in the crime market. So this is something we've been studying with Paolo to try to understand what's happening here. And so Paolo has an amazing paper, which is called Clicking on Heaven's Door, because he has the exact time people were registering to become legal in Italy, the exact minutes. And there was quotas. So basically, if you were 1 second after the quota, you were not much less likely to be legal. And so this is not the legal, this is the second stage, but basically it uses exactly who became legal or not, depending on when you clicked on the national, because they did amnesties to become a national, but they had quotas. What he finds is that the crime rate is much higher for those who just didn't get the legal status. So the big argument is, of course, in here, we get some immigrants who are not legal. It's just counting as foreigners. So legal status matters. So all the ones who are illegal in a way might end up there. So they're not in official statistics. So that might be a reason. But that still shouldn't explain the crime rates at the area level, why they're so different. But just to give you an idea of that. A second one, which is very interesting, I'll just give you an example of a paper. Discrimination. Your first thought should have been, yes, but this is happening because in Austria, they just put 10 times more someone arrested for the same crime in prison, a foreigner than a native. There's a bit of discrimination in arrest, then by the judges, then by the prison system, everywhere, okay? And there is, I'm going to show you one of the nicest recent paper on this. The US, they use Black Americans, of course, more. This is by a young guy in Texas, Tuttle, Cody. And what you can see here, this is the amount of grams of crack cocaine found on average. Before 2011, when they introduced the law, is to get something severe, you will need 280. The police measures how much drugs you have, and then they put you a sentence. But look what happens once the law says, well, to put people in prison, you have to have 280. It's a bit weird. I mean, suddenly people didn't carry 280, but the police just moved it. And clearly you can see the shock. You know, how many percent of cases which are exactly 280 or above, you know. But where is it coming from? White offenders, Black and Hispanic. Okay, so these are just evidence of the discrimination. Why am I? It sounds easy to test, but it's super hard to test because there are differences between immigrants and natives in terms of loads of things. So you really need small experiments to try to see what really matters. Okay, to get causal evidence. So let me tell you about what we're doing with Paulo. This is very early. Don't mention it. Don't take pictures. It's not. Yes. So those two other explanations to really answer the puzzle. You know, not more area crimes, but much more people in prison would have to be huge. So we propose in a forthcoming paper one day, the idea of substitution as a mechanism. So if you think of migrants replace natives in the crime market because it has very low wage and no barriers to entry. So if you cannot work because of any reason and anything, up you can go in the crime market. There's no demand for a certificate or anything. Okay? So this solves the puzzle because you would get more arrested, but no increase in area level crime. Okay? But you have to understand this is a tough hypothesis because it means that when more migrants in one area, you should see a drop in native crime. This is the main thing. You should see less natives committing crime. Migrants might commit the same amount per person crime, but the natives should stop committing. Well, you should see a small displacement. Okay? So imagine, you know, it's just this. So this is what we do in the Netherlands. So we have all the refugee center openings across the country. We know the timing and everything, exactly how many crimes are committed by who at the individual level. And then we do some, so this is the number of offenses committed by everyone. You don't want to do pre-trends. T0 is when the centers open. And within 3 months, this is demanding. This is like the whole native population. You see drops in number of natives committing crimes. Right? So there is some kind of substitution from one to the other, which also you can see here from the asylum seekers going up. Interestingly, it doesn't move around the number of non-Westerners, so of immigrants. So the US, the Dutch, non-Western are the low-skilled immigrants. Western are the high-skilled. That's, I mean, you do the math. You check the level. Except Indonesians are here, but they're still high-skilled relative to the rest of the world. Okay, and this is interesting, and this is why now we're looking at networks. Are they creating networks with the other criminals to do all this? Okay, so I'm going to leave you with those thoughts. This is the kind of thing I discuss in my course, and this is you didn't discuss crime, but I think it must have been a big issue, and you discussed 2 murders. And people are even, you know, they see any kind of violence. I imagine gunshots in Aruba are not as frequent as in some other places.
I think there's 2 things. There's one, the issue of crime, and then xenophobia is very much targeting Black women.
Ah, yeah.
And okay. Issue of prostitution, of prostitution on men, you know, there's a lot of the xenophobia sort of focus on women.
So I'm hoping the positive message is at least that information helps. That in all of that you've seen. Okay, well, thanks. It's a Q&A time now, maybe not just for me, so maybe someone online has questions for the IRP or the audience.
Okay, and anyways, Prof.
Okay, thank you.
Professor, and
can
I just from Study Association.
Can I have a question to HIAS or not?
Absolutely.
Yes, I'm on the stage, but no, because I'm wondering how.
Take off the...
Yes, sorry, you deal with do you bring in